There are names in our history books that were never meant to survive the passage of time, names whispered in parish halls, scribbled in the margins of police ledgers, and buried in brittle letters folded into cedar boxes. Among them is the name of a girl forgotten by all but the most obsessive record keepers, whose memory carried more than recollections. It carried indictments. Her name was Clara Weiss. Born in Milwaukee in 1859, she belonged to no noble line, commanded no inheritance, and held no station of authority. Yet her mind was unlike that of any child her age. Clara remembered everything, not as faint impressions or fragments, but entire conversations word for word and sights with the clarity of glass. In another century such a gift might have secured her a place in academia. In her own it doomed her to an early grave. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. In the winter of 1876, 3 years after her disappearance, snow drifted thick over Milwaukee's 3rd Ward, muffling the sound of wagon wheels and burying the scarred timbers of burned-out buildings. The Weiss home was long since demolished, its cellar filled with stones, but children passing the vacant lot still crossed themselves, whispering that voices echoed there when the wind cut from the river. Though the city pressed forward, new factories rising, new ships docking, the shadow of Violet Mueller lingered. To some she was a ghost story, to others a martyr, and to the few who had truly known her she was a wound that time refused to close. The church's reckonings. Michael's church, once the heart of the German parish, bore the heaviest burden. Father O'Brien, aging quickly in the years after the scandal, carried journals heavy with the girl's remembered sins, volumes of human corruption written not by her hand, but through. He locked them away, vowing they would never be read until after his death. Yet his silence did not shield the parish. Attendance dwindled. Friday confession became nearly deserted, as families no longer trusted the veil of secrecy. Mothers forbade their children to linger after service, and when whispers spread that Father O'Brien had conducted memory sessions with the child, suspicion turned upon him as well. By 1880, the diocese introduced formal protocols banning any interpreter under the age of 21. The measure became known unofficially as the Milwaukee Protocol. Priests were instructed to keep records of translators, and bishops stressed that confessions must remain untainted by the involvement of innocence. Though not spoken aloud, every cleric knew these rules were written in the girl's blood. The city's wound. For the city, Violet's tale became both shame and legend. Officials attempted to suppress her name from newspapers, but rumor traveled faster than ink. Immigrant workers carried her story westward along the rail lines, telling it in saloons and bunkhouses. They spoke of the girl who remembered everything, the child whose mouth could not close upon the sins of men. Some twisted the tale into a parable, warning children never to gossip. Others claimed her gift was divine punishment sent upon sinners. But among the poor and pardonless, her story became something else entirely, proof that even a child could pierce the armor of powerful men. The tannery ruin remained standing until 1890, avoided like a cursed ground. When it was finally demolished, workers reported finding scraps of wood carved with words in a childish hand. Most dismissed it as fancy, yet Vogel, still alive then, insisted they were genuine. Her memory is stronger than stone, she said, and stone crumbled. The fugitives, of the men whose crimes Violet had revealed, few lived long enough to see the new century. Kellerman drowned in the river, Brenner crushed in his own brewery, Steinberg vanished in a tavern quarrel, and Woolmer died before justice could reach him. But Hans Richter was different. His name slipped through city ledgers like smoke. By the 1880s he had vanished entirely, rumored to have taken on new identities in Kansas, Colorado, even California. Detectives swore he established businesses under false papers, continuing his predation. The city declared him legally dead in 1920, but Captain Donohue's final notebook, penned in retirement, rejected that notion. Men like Richter do not die when the law pronounces them so. They live on, feeding in new shadows. Vogel's testimony. Brunhild Vogel, once the child's guardian, became the chronicler of her tragedy. In 1885 she privately printed a slim volume in German titled Das Mädchen der Geheimnisse, The Girl of Secret. It contained fragments of Violet's remembered words, copied faithfully from scraps of paper and memory. Though circulated quietly, it became the foundation for every later account. Scholars of immigration, criminology, and church history would cite Vogel's work for more than a century. In her preface, she wrote, "She was not a prophet, nor a spy, nor a liar. She was a child who could not forget, and in a world built upon secrets, a child who cannot forget is more dangerous than any weapon." The last memorial. Shortly before his retirement in 1895, Father O'Brien arranged for a plaque to be set in the entry of St. Michael's, small, bronze, and easily overlooked. It bore a single inscription: "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." He never named her directly. The church did not permit it, but the parishioners knew. Mothers touched the plaque when passing. Children asked why it was there, and were shushed. Yet the act itself was a confession, the only one the priest ever permitted to escape. O'Brien died in 1902, and when his journals were found, the diocese sealed them away. Rumors persist they still exist in a locked archive, volumes of human sin preserved because a child once repeated them aloud. The century turns. By 1923, when demolition workers unearthed Woolmer's hidden compartment, the city could no longer deny the truth. The documents confirmed child trafficking, extortion, and partnership with Rick. More hauntingly, they confirmed the accuracy of every word Violet had spoken half a century earlier. The press reported the discovery with morbid fascination. For the first time her name was printed openly in English. Violet Mueller, the girl who spoke secrets no one should know. Historians, criminologists and reformers seized upon the case. Some argued she had been America's first child witness to organized crime. Others insisted she was merely collateral in a larger struggle between immigrants, poverty and power. But all agreed, she had been telling the truth. The lingering dread, even with truth revealed, her absence remained unbearable. No grave bore her name. No bones were ever identified. It was as if the city had swallowed her whole. Yet stories persisted. Old dock workers swore they heard her humming near the river on foggy nights. Tenement children claimed a pale figure whispered in their ear when they thought of stealing. Mothers warned that if you lied, the girl who remembers would find you. Vogel herself died in 1901, but her last letter to a cousin contained a chilling line: "I sometimes dream she is still alive, speaking secrets into the dark, and the dark listens." Epilogue: a memory that cannot die. Today, Violet Mueller remains both legend and lesson. Scholars cite her as proof of the dangers faced by vulnerable witnesses. Clergy recall her case when teaching about the sanctity of confession. And in Milwaukee, a quiet memorial garden near the site of Michael's holds a stone marked only with her name and year: Violet Mueller, 1861-1873. Visitors leave candles, dolls, or scraps of paper with written confessions, ritual offerings to a child who once carried the unbearable weight of truth. But among the offerings, one artifact stands out. In 1978, during renovation of a nearby rectory, workers discovered a slip of faded parchment tucked within a hymnal. On it, written in an unmistakably childish hand, were two words: "I remember." The ink had not faded. The letters looked fresh, as though written that very morning. And so the silence never held. Her memory, the memory of a child who spoke what no one dared, lives on, echoing through the city she haunted, warning that secrets buried in darkness will one day claw their way to light. The story begins in 1871, inside the narrow corridors of Milwaukee's German Quarter, where the air itself smelled of beer hops, tallow smoke and wet timber. Clara was 12 years old when she first astonished her neighbors. Her father, Andreas Weiss, a cooper by trade, often relied on her to help with the language barrier between older parishioners and English-speaking priests at St. Mary's Chapel. Though only a child, she translated confessions, funerals and baptisms with precision beyond her year. But her precision was also her curse. During one winter confession in January of that year, Clara repeated aloud, in perfect German, a man's whispered sins to the parish priest. She did not soften them, did not abbreviate, did not allow them to fade into generality. She recalled every detail, including names, locations and deeds. The priest, startled, begged her afterward never to repeat them again. Clara, eyes wide and unblinking, replied only, "I cannot forget what I hear." Word spread quickly. At first her gift was admired. Local mothers called her a prodigy, fathers praised her honesty. But among men who carried burdensome pasts, Clara became something else entirely: a liability. In the spring of 1871, Clara began to speak of things she should not have known. At the family table, she described conversations between grown men overheard years before, preserved in her mind like insects trapped in amber. She named places where goods had been hidden, debts had been settled, and children had been punished. At first her parents dismissed these as childhood fancies, until Clara's details matched police reports of unsolved burglaries. Her neighbor Matthias Schreiber, a tavern keeper, was the first to confront the Weiss family. According to later testimony, he warned Andreas that the girl was too sharp for her own good, and that dangerous men did not forgive sharp children. Andreas tried to silence her, even forbidding her from attending church alone. But Clara could not help herself. She continued to One evening, While helping her mother Lena Weiss mend a hem, Clara recited a conversation she had heard in the tavern's back room, nearly 4 years earlier. She repeated every word in the exact inflection of the speaker. The names she spoke belonged to men with long shadows in the community, immigrants who had fled charges in Europe, now attempting to live as respectable tradesmen in America. Lena dropped her needle in shock. She later confessed to a neighbor that it was as though the walls themselves had found a tongue, and the tongue was my child's. By summer, the matter had escalated. Clara's uncanny recollections were no longer charming. They were dangerous. She began to describe things that made even Father Aloysius Brenner, the parish priest, uneasy. During one confession, she translated for an older man who muttered about debts in the cellar. Clara did not merely convey the words. She described the cellar, the ledgers within it, the precise number of coins mentioned, details the old man had not spoken aloud. Father Brenner, shaken, questioned her afterward. Had she seen the cellar? Did someone tell her? Clara shook her head. No, she whispered. I only hear, and it stays. By then, whispers of her ability had spread beyond the parish. Some regarded her as cursed. Others, more quietly, regarded her as useful, if her memory could be directed. One of those who took interest was Karl Eckhart, a former apothecary from Hamburg, with a history of malpractice. He had resettled in Milwaukee under a different name, and operated a discreet dispensary behind a blacksmith shop. When Clara, in the presence of her father, repeated details about Karl's past misdeeds, details she could not possibly have known, Karl's composure fractured. He accused her of witchcraft, of bringing shame to honest men. But privately, he began to inquire about whether the Weiss family might be persuaded to leave town or silenced. The Weiss household grew tense. Lena prayed openly for deliverance. Andreas, once proud of his daughter's usefulness, now snapped at her for speaking. Clara herself seemed burdened. It is too heavy, she told her mother one night. The words do not leave me, even when I sleep. She began to show signs of exhaustion, dark rings beneath her eyes, an anxious tremor in her hands. Still, the memories came. On August 3, 1871, a gathering at Schreiber's tavern ended in heated argument when Clara interrupted a conversation between older men by perfectly repeating a drunken confession one of them had made years earlier, implicating others at the table. Witnesses claimed the room fell silent, then erupted into shouting. Schreiber himself dragged the child from the tavern, cursing her as a devil's scribe. That night, Andreas recorded in his journal the only surviving personal document from him, that he feared for his daughter's life. Clara's tongue, he wrote, is a blade sharper than any knife, and she cannot sheath it. The tension came to a head in late August. According to Mrs. Gertrude Albrecht, a neighbor who later gave testimony, Clara was approached by 2 older men while fetching water at the communal pump. They pressed coins into her hand and urged her not to repeat anything she heard about them. Clara, confused, dropped the coins and fled. She later told her mother she felt unclean, as though their words had been not. Soon after, Andreas noticed men watching the house from across the narrow lane. One evening, he found a note nailed to his door. Keep her quiet, or we will. The Weiss family turned to Father Brenner for counsel. He urged them to send Clara away to relatives in Sheboygan, or Chicago, anywhere her gift might go unnoticed. Andreas resisted, believing relocation would not undo her nature, yet he too began to sense the inevitability of what was coming. Clara herself seemed resigned. I do not want to speak, she told her father, but the words find me. I do not call them, but they come. Andreas, trembling, asked her if she remembered everything she herself said. Clara paused, then whispered, yes, I remember even the silence. By autumn, Milwaukee's immigrant quarter buzzed with uneasy rumors. Some claimed the girl was blessed, others cursed, and others still whispered that she carried the devil's ledger in her head. Whatever the truth, the Weiss family stood isolated. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Parishioners fell silent when Clara entered the chapel. On September 12, 1871, Father Brenner recorded in the parish register, the child Clara W. possesses a memory, which endangers her innocence and perhaps her life. She is not safe among us, for men fear her tongue more than they fear the Lord's judgment. It was the first official acknowledgement that what Clara carried in her mind was not merely extraordinary, it was perilous. By the close of the year, Andreas could no longer deny that danger pressed in from every side. He appealed to a local detective, Captain Lawrence Doyle, for protection. Doyle listened but dismissed the case. Words are not evidence, he remarked. A child's tongue is quick, but it cannot hang a man in court. Andreas left the station more fearful than before. If the law would not intervene, then Clara's survival would depend on chance,
All providence. It is here, in the waning weeks of 1871, that the first part of her story ends, with a child burdened by memory, a family cornered by suspicion, and a community caught between pity and fear. The record grows darker from this point forward.
The weeks following the parish register entry of September 1871 marked a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere surrounding the Weiss family. What had once been whispered gossip now hardened into palpable suspicion. It was no longer just curious neighbors peering from behind lace curtains or muttered accusations of witchcraft outside the chapel. It became, in the words of Mrs. Gertrude Albrecht, a community holding its breath, waiting for the child to speak again, fearing what she might say. At the center of this unease stood Clara herself, solemn and withdrawn, yet still unable to resist the compulsion of her memory. One autumn evening, Clara startled her father by recounting in painstaking detail a confession she had translated years earlier. The penitent had spoken vaguely of a lost shipment of grain during his voyage from Hamburg. But Clara now expanded upon the account with startling specificity. She recalled the number of barrels, the name of the ship's captain, and the precise docking time in Milwaukee's harbor. None of these details had been spoken aloud at the time, yet Clara produced them without hesitation. Andreas, weary and alarmed, demanded to know how she had acquired such knowledge. Clara only lowered her eyes and whispered, "It is as though the words grow while they sleep inside me." It was a strange admission that memories were not fixed but living, expanding, taking on new forms within her mind. For Andreas, the realization carried a more dreadful weight. Clara's ability was not static. It was evolving. Word of this incident reached Miss Helene Vogel, a midwife and respected matron of the quarter. Mrs. Vogel, herself, familiar with the mysteries of memory and inherited traits through her work in families, approached the Weiss household cautious. She urged Andreas to consider that his daughter might not be cursed but afflicted, perhaps with a rare disorder of the nerves or blood. Her theory, though speculative, gained traction among a small circle of educated parishioners who had encountered the language of nervous conditions in German medical pamphlets. They spoke of hysteria, of hereditary weakness, of children burdened with unusual faculties when families intermarried within small immigrant circles. The suggestion cast a shadow, not only on Clara but on the Weiss lineage itself. Andreas bristled at such insinuations, yet he could not ignore the resemblance of Clara's affliction to his late sister, who had been prone to fits of uncanny recollection before her untimely death. It was whispered in the family that she too had remembered too much. The church's involvement deepened. Father Aloysius Brenner, having already warned the family, now sought counsel from his superior Monsignor Heinrich Langenfeld, recently arrived from Chicago. Langenfeld was a cautious man, familiar with scandals that could erupt when parishioners' sins were mishandled. To him, Clara represented not only a spiritual anomaly, but a threat to the sanctity of confession itself. In a letter preserved in diocesan archives, he wrote, "If it be true that this child holds within her the precise recollections of every word spoken in the confessional, then the very sacrament is endangered. Secrecy is not merely violated by loose tongues, but by the unnatural permanence of memory. The matter requires both theological and practical remedy." Langenfeld recommended that Clara never again serve as translator for the confessional, yet the damage had already been done. She had overheard too much, spoken too freely, and in the process had accumulated a dangerous catalogue of men's private sins. The tension escalated when Clara's memory implicated Otto Baumann, a carpenter known for his charitable facade but rumored to have darker dealings. One Sunday, Clara startled the congregation by loudly repeating, during a catechism exercise, a conversation Baumann had held years earlier about concealing debts through false ledgers. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried across the chapel. Baumann's face reportedly drained of color. He rose abruptly, muttered a curse, and stormed from the church. From that day, the Weiss family noticed him lurking nearby, watching Clara with an intensity that chilled them. Mrs. Vogel, unsettled, became one of the few allies the family retained. She documented Clara's recollections with meticulous care, filling a small ledger with the girl's words. The pages, written in tight German script, survive today in a private collection. They read less like a child's ramblings and more like depositions, each entry carefully dated, each recollection aligned with external events. The ledger records an incident in October 1871, when Clara woke from a dream and recited verbatim a violent quarrel between two men in the tavern basement, complete with threats, slurred dialect and a description of the lantern that hung above them. Investigations later confirmed that such an altercation had indeed occurred, though no child could have witnessed it. Mrs. Vogel's entries note, the child speaks as though she carries a phonograph within her head, yet unlike the machine, her memory does not merely repeat, it interprets, colors and amplifies. It is both record and commentary. As Clara's abilities grew harder to dismiss, Andreas found himself torn between pride and terror. He once believed his daughter's gift might protect their family, exposing liars and criminals. Now he saw it drew danger closer with every word. His neighbors treated him with suspicion, his customers dwindled, even his wife Lena wept openly during Mass, as though already mourning. Yet Clara remained oddly serene. She confessed to her mother that she sometimes felt lifted out of herself, as though listening to voices that hovered in the air long after the speakers had departed. She spoke of words like stains that could not be washed away. Even when I close my eyes, she said, I see the shapes of their mouths moving. By November, a quiet investigation had begun, not by the police, who saw no crime, but by parishioners desperate to know what Clara remembered of them. Some approached her, under the guise of kindness, pressing sweets or coins into her hand, only to recoil when she calmly recited details from their pasts. Others grew openly hostile, warning Andreas that his child would bring ruin upon the quarter. One chilling episode is recorded in Miss Vogel's ledger, a late-night visit by Wilhelm Krauss, a miller with a violent reputation. He demanded entry to the Weiss home, insisting he must know what Clara remembered of him. Andreas barred the door, but Clara herself answered from within, You killed the dog in your yard when you were a boy, and you laughed as it choked. Krauss fled into the night shouting that the child was possessed, but the damage was done. The tale spread like wildfire. Clara was no longer merely gifted, she was feared. Father Brenner attempted one final intervention. In December 1871, he visited the Weiss household, accompanied by Wilhelm, a young seminarian sent to observe. They sat with Clara for hours, questioning her gently, testing the extent of her recall. She answered every query without hesitation. The precise wording of sermons delivered years earlier, the sequence of hymns sung at her baptism, even the faintly muttered prayers of strangers at the communion rail. Wilhelm, pale and shaken, recorded in his notes, She speaks, as one possessed not by demons, but by memory itself. It is not natural, yet neither is it false. Brenner concluded the session with a grave warning to Andreas and Lena. Your daughter is a vessel too fragile for what she carries, and there are men who will see in her not a vessel but a threat. Thus ended the year 1871 for the Weiss family, with their daughter increasingly isolated, their community divided, and the shadow of danger lengthened. What had begun as an innocent child's ability to remember had become a perilous weight, straining both faith and family. The records from this period reveal not yet violence, but the gathering of forces, the sharpening of knives in the dark, the whispering of names in taverns, the drawing of invisible lines around a child whose only crime was remembrance. Clara's story was not yet at its bloodiest, but it was already at its most precarious. The year turned, and with it the fragile tolerance that had once protected Clara White. Winter descended upon Milwaukee with a merciless chill, freezing the riverbanks, and filling the narrow streets of the German Quarter with the smoke of coal stoves. It was during those bleak months of January and February 1872 that Clara's world, already precarious, began to unravel. The Weiss household lived in near seclusion. Andreas, fearing reprisal, no longer allowed Clara to attend Mass, except under strict watch. Lena forbade her from playing with other children, for their parents had forbidden contact. Yet even confinement did not silence the girl. Her memory, ever restless, demanded to be voiced. She spoke to herself in the dim lamplight, rehearsing forgotten quarrels, muttering ancient sermons, murmuring the sighs of the dying as though she had carried them whole into the present. Lena wept each time she overheard her daughter in these trances, begging Andreas to seek help, medical, spiritual, any help at all. But Andreas hesitated. He knew that to expose Clara to physicians risked ridicule, and to the church risked worse, exorcism, or the branding of witchcraft. And so the family endured in silence, while the city whispered. The earliest public rupture came on January 12, 1872, during the funeral of a respected brewer named Karl Wendt. Clara, standing beside her parents,
suddenly recited Went's private admission of adulterating his beer with river water during the famine years. Gasps spread through the mourners. Went's widow collapsed in shame. The priest attempted to cover the outburst with hurried prayers, but the damage lingered. For many, Clara's intrusion into the sacred solemnity of death was proof that she was no mere oddity. She was a danger to the dignity of the community. From that day, the Weiss home was marked. Stones struck the shutters at night. Neighbors crossed themselves when Clara passed. A crude sign was nailed to their door. Die Hex pricked. The witch speaks. In February, new threats emerged, not from the fearful but from the curious. A group of young men, students from the fledgling Milwaukee Normal School, approached Andreas with an offer. They wished to study Clara, to test her abilities under controlled circumstances, to prove or disprove her memory in the language of science. They spoke of progress, of medical journals, of recognition that might even bring the family wealth. Andreas was tempted, if only for the promise of vindication, but Lena recoiled, declaring that her daughter would not be caged like an animal. Clara herself sat silent through their visit, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. Only when the men had gone did she whisper, "They will not study me, they will open me." Her words chilled Andreas to the marrow. Meanwhile, enemies gathered in darker corners. The miller Wilhelm Krauss, still stung by Clara's revelation of his childhood cruelty, began rallying men in taverns. He warned that the girl would ruin livelihoods, destroy marriages, bring the wrath of God upon the court. His voice was joined by others, those who feared what Clara might know of them, or simply hungered for a scapegoat to blame for hard times. Among the most vocal was Otto Baumann, the carpenter Clara had exposed months earlier. He whispered of forming a vigilance committee, urging that the law would not intervene but the people must. Baumann's words grew bolder with each pint of ale, until even those who doubted Clara's powers began to believe she was worth fearing. In the midst of this rising hostility, Clara's abilities grew stranger still. Mrs. Vogel's surviving ledger records an incident on February 23, when Clara began to recall not only what she had heard, but what she had not. She described a silence in the confessional, the hesitation of a sinner, the tightening of breath, the unspoken words trembling on the edge of speech. She claimed she could remember what had been withheld, as though memory itself carried the shadow of omission. Miss Vogel wrote, "This is no longer memory alone, it is something more, an intuition of silence, a listening to absence. If such a gift exists, it cannot remain long without consequence." Indeed, consequence arrived swiftly. On the night of March 3, 1872, the Weiss home was assaulted. Stones shattered windows, curses rang out. A crude effigy of Clara was burned in the street. Andreas, armed with only a hammer, defended the doorway while Lena clutched Clara in the shadow. Neighbors claimed the girl did not cry but instead whispered the names of those outside one by one, recounting sins they had confessed years earlier. The mob scattered before dawn, leaving the Weiss family shaken and isolated. Word spread, and soon the story of the child who spoke men's secrets reached beyond Milwaukee. It is from this period that the first newspaper clipping survives, a brief note in the Milwaukee Daily Sentinel, dismissing the affair as a curious superstition among our German immigrants. Yet even ridicule carried Clara's name farther than safety allowed. In the weeks following the attack, Andreas considered flight. Letters from relatives in Sheboygan and Chicago urged him to relocate, promising work and a chance for Clara to begin anew, but Lena refused. She argued that running would confirm their guilt, that Clara must endure until her affliction passed. Clara herself seemed indifferent. When asked what she wished, she replied only, "Wherever we go the words will follow." Spring approached, but peace did not. A second wave of attention arrived, not from neighbors or students, but from strangers of higher station. One was Professor Ernst Schneider, a physician from Chicago with ties to the burgeoning field of neurology. He visited the Weiss home under the guise of charity, offering treatment for Clara's nervous excesses. Yet his questions betrayed another motive. He spoke of demonstrations, of lectures, of a miracle of memory that would astonish the academies of Europe. Andreas, wary yet desperate, entertained the idea. Lena resisted. Clara, as ever, sat silent, her face pale in the lamplight. When pressed, she murmured, "The professor does not wish to heal me, he wishes to keep me." This remark unsettled even Schneider, who withdrew with forced courtesy. But he left a calling card upon the mantel, a reminder that others, beyond the parish and the quarter, now coveted what Clara carried. By April 1872, the Weiss family's plight had become untenable. They were shunned by most, threatened by some, courted by others. Every choice seemed perilous. To remain was to risk violence. To flee was to risk exploitation. The surviving records suggest Andreas made one final appeal to the church. In a desperate letter to Monsignor Langenfeld, he begged for protection, arguing that Clara's affliction was not of her making. Langenfeld replied with cool detachment, "The child is dangerous not because she lies, but because she remembers. What remedy can there be, save silence?" That word silence hung like a curse, and so the Weiss family entered the late spring of 1872, trapped between fire and flood. Clara's memory grew ever more burdensome, her presence ever more perilous, yet fate, as it so often does, had only begun its cruel work. The story that would later be remembered as the tragedy of Violet Mueller was poised to turn bloodier, darker, and far more irreversible. The spring of 1872 in Milwaukee should have brought renewal. Snowmelt filled the gutters, and vendors pushed carts of early greens through the cobbled streets. But for the Weiss household, the thaw only unveiled the rot that winter had concealed. Their windows, still cracked from the March riot, were patched with boards. Neighbors who once exchanged bread and kindling now crossed the street to avoid them. The family was not simply isolated, they were marked, and in that isolation, darker forces began to stir. On April 19, a letter arrived at the Weiss home, without signature or seal, its contents, preserved in the Milwaukee Historical Society's collection of immigrant documents, were chilling in their bluntness.
The child must be silenced. Your neighbors will no longer tolerate her tongue. If you cannot contain her, others will. Leave the city or bury your shame. Andreas read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, his hands trembling. Lena covered her mouth to stifle a cry. Clara, however, listened with the same eerie composure that had begun to unnerve even her parents. When the reading was done, she whispered, "They will not let us leave. They will follow." Andreas dismissed her words as childish fear, yet in his heart he knew she was right. What followed in late April was a campaign of intimidation that historians now recognize as coordinated. Reports in private diaries mention strangers loitering near the Weiss home, men not of the parish, speaking English rather than German, watching the house by day and disappearing by night. Some suspected they were hired agents of Milwaukee's criminal underworld, whose secrets Clara had begun to touch upon without knowing their weight. Among the names whispered in connection was Hans Richter, a tavern keeper already notorious for dealings in smuggling and gambling. Though direct evidence of his involvement remains scarce, later discoveries in demolished cellars would confirm his role in far darker enterprises. Whether by his hand or others, the Weiss family was being cornered. It was during this same period that Clara's abilities reached a disturbing new stage. Mrs. Vogel, who maintained her friendship despite public scorn, recorded a visit on April 27. She found Clara seated alone, tracing letters into the dust upon the floorboard. The child explained that she was writing words she had never heard but always known. When pressed, Clara spoke of conversations that had taken place behind closed doors, words never spoken in her presence but somehow imprinted within her memory as though the very walls had carried them to her. Mrs. Vogel described the sensation of listening to her as standing at the edge of a bottomless well, hearing echoes that should not exist. Theologians later debated whether this represented clairvoyance, psychometry, or a delusion of persecution, but to the Weiss family it was simple terror. Their daughter no longer merely remembered, she unveiled. By May of 1872, both church and community had reached a breaking point. Monsignor Langenfeld convened a private council of priests and senior parishioners. Though the minutes of this meeting have not survived, secondary accounts suggest serious measures were discussed, ranging from confinement to exorcism. Andreas was summoned, pressured to relinquish his daughter to ecclesiastical custody. He refused with quiet defiance, insisting that Clara was no demon, no witch, but simply a child cursed with memory too keen for this world. His refusal marked the family as adversaries not only of their neighbors but of their church. That same week, Andreas lost his position at the tannery. The dismissal, delivered curtly by his foreman, cited unrest among the men who refused to work alongside the father of the witch. With no income, the Weiss family slipped into poverty. It was under these conditions of fear and want that the most sinister visitors appeared. On the night of May 18, two men knocked at the Weiss door. They claimed to be sympathizers, friends of the family, offering safe passage to relatives in Chicago. Andreas, desperate, nearly accepted, but Clara stood before the door, rigid, whispering, "Do not go." One carries a knife, the other carries rope. Startled, Andreas demanded proof of their intentions. The men departed with oaths and threats. Weeks later, a neighbor swore he saw the same figures in Richter's tavern, their pockets heavy with coin. Summer approached, but instead of relief came suffocating dread. On June 7, the Weiss home was broken into while the family slept. No money was taken, nor food. Only Clara's few notebooks, collections of names, phrases, memories she had compulsively written, were stolen. Days later, fragments of those pages were found in the gutter outside Michael's, torn and trampled. The message was clear. Clara's words would not be allowed to survive. And yet she continued to speak them. Witnesses recall a Sunday service in late June, when Clara, kneeling beside her parents, suddenly recited a confession that had never been translated aloud. Her voice, high and unwavering, declared the sins of a man seated only 3 pews away, a respected shopkeeper, whose dealings with stolen goods had long been suspected, but never proven. The congregation erupted, women screamed, men surged forward. The family fled under a hail of curses and fists, protected only by the desperate strength of Andreas. After that day, the Weiss family never again entered St. Michael's. The violence that summer did not cease. Chickens were slaughtered and left upon their doorstep. A fire was set against their shed. Lena fell ill from ceaseless strain, her face drawn, her hair streaked with premature gray. Andreas, aged a decade in months, his shoulders stooped, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. And Clara grew stranger still. She ceased to play, ceased to laugh, ceased to behave as a child at all. Instead she listened, always listened, as though the very air whispered to her. Once, Mrs. Vogel found her in the cellar, repeating the conversations of men drinking in Richter's tavern half a street away. The accuracy of her words was later confirmed by one of the drinkers themselves, horrified to learn he had been overheard through brick and stone. It was then that whispers of the girl who could not be deceived reached the ears of men far more dangerous than superstitious neighbors. By July 1872, Clara's fate was sealed, though her family did not yet know it. The combination of poverty, persecution, and unwanted attention had created the perfect storm. Those who feared exposure saw her as a mortal threat. Those who sought profit saw her as a prize. And caught between these powers, the Weiss family dwindled into exhaustion, too weakened to resist the calamity that approached. The city records fall largely silent at this point, broken only by scattered notations. Andreas pawning his tools for bread, Lena treated for hysteria, Clara glimpsed wandering the riverbanks alone. But silence in the archives does not mean safety. It means the shadows had begun their work. And from those shadows, history tells us, would soon emerge the tragedy that transformed Clara Weiss into Violet Mueller, the child martyr remembered not for her life, but for the terrible secrets she spoke. By the autumn of 1872, Milwaukee's air had grown heavy with coal smoke and suspicion. The Weiss family remained under siege, neighbors hostile, the church estranged, and their livelihood reduced to scraps. Yet even in such misery, a few figures from outside the parish circle took interest in Clara. Unlike those who sought to destroy her, these new visitors sought to study. The first was Dr. Elias Grunwald, a physician of German descent attached to the county hospital. Trained in Heidelberg, Grunwald had an interest in disorders of memory and perception. He had heard rumors of the Weiss child from both priests and constables, and requested permission to observe her. The records of his examinations, preserved in a faded ledger at the Milwaukee Medical Archive, form one of the most unsettling medical case studies of the 19th century. On September 14, 1872, Grunwald recorded his first encounter. Subject, Clara Weiss, female, age 12, physically small for her age, pale, with signs of malnutrition. Eyes large and dark, gaze unusually fixed. Demeanor quiet, responsive when addressed, yet inclined to anticipate questions before asked. He described a series of tests. Clara was read a passage from the Psalms in Latin, a language she had never been taught. She recited the passage back, word for word. When presented with a page of Greek letters, she spoke them aloud with hesitation, yet unmistakable accuracy. Grunwald concluded she possessed a faculty not of knowledge, but of retention, an ability to recall any sound, any word, even though she did not understand, after a single hearing. Yet it was her second demonstration that chilled him. Asked to describe his own whispered aside to a colleague at the far end of the room, Clara repeated every syllable, though no other ear had caught them. Grunwald noted in the margin, either extraordinary auditory acuity, or something beyond the physical senses. Such perception would render privacy impossible. News of Grunwald's observations spread quickly among the city's educated elite. Some dismissed him as a charlatan, others urged further inquiry. One man, who responded, was Professor Anton Drossel, a phrenologist and lecturer at Marquette. Drossel was convinced Clara's abilities lay in the structure of her skull, and sought to measure her cranium, charting bumps and ridges in the belief that memory had a physical seat. On October 3, he visited the Weiss home, accompanied by his instruments, calipers, measuring tapes, plaster mold. Clara tolerated his probing fingers with stoic patience, but when he pressed too firmly above her left ear, she winced and murmured, "That is where the voices rest." The remark so unsettled Drossel that he abandoned the examination, declaring her case unsuited to phrenology. In his later notes he confessed, "I felt not that I was touching bone, but some hidden repository of the city's sins." The Weiss parents endured these examinations with mixed feelings. On one hand, they hoped the attention of scholars might shield Clara from mob hostility. On the other, each visit seemed only to deepen her estrangement from childhood. She no longer played with dolls or sang songs. She sat in silence, staring at the walls, as though waiting for secrets to seep through them. It was during this time that Lena confided in Miss Vogel, despairing that her daughter no longer belongs to us. She spoke of nights when Clara would awaken screaming words in foreign tongues, words no one could understand, words that smelled of sulfur when uttered. The mother feared her child was being consumed by the very gift that had first made her remarkable. Meanwhile, Richter's shadow grew darker. Several tavern patrons reported overhearing him mock the Weiss family, boasting that the little witch would not live to see another Christmas. Such threats were dismissed by police as drunken bravado, but the Weiss household took them as prophecy. Andreas fortified the door with iron bars and slept with an axe beside his bed. Yet hunger forced him to leave the house by day, seeking work, leaving Lena and Clara exposed. On more than one occasion, the girl was followed through the market by strangers. Only her uncanny ability to recall faces and voices prevented her from being lured into traps. She named each pursuer later, describing where they had been the night before, what words they had spoken, how much liquor they had drunk. Her descriptions matched reality too closely to dismiss. It was clear to all who still watched over her, Clara's survival depended not on innocence, but on her frightening forensic memory. By November, Grunwald persuaded Andreas to allow a more formal examination. At the hospital, the doctor, ever clinical, hoped to determine whether Clara's perceptions were accompanied by physical abnormalities. Using primitive galvanic instruments, he measured her pulse and ocular dilation when exposed to whispered confessions from volunteers. The results were astonishing. Each time a secret was spoken, even in a language foreign to her, Clara's pulse quickened, her pupils expanded, her body trembled as if straining beneath the weight of the words. She would then repeat them, without hesitation, often with eerie mimicry of the speaker's voice. Grunwald wrote, "The child does not merely recall, she inhabits. Secrets enter her as though her body were the confessional itself. An unwilling archive of sin." The final line of that entry remains underlined. This condition, if uncontrolled, will render her a danger both to herself and to the society that surrounds her. That same winter, Lena's health deteriorated. The strain of persecution, poverty and her daughter's unnatural role consumed her strength. Parish records note her admittance to the Sisters of Charity infirmary with nervous exhaustion and pulmonary weakness. Though she survived the season, she was never again seen in robust health. Andreas, left to manage both household and child, sank into despair. His letters from this period, brittle with age, speak of an unending winter of the soul, and a daughter who carries not childhood but judgment upon her brow. One particularly grim entry dated December 12, 1872, describes an incident when Andreas discovered Clara writing furiously by candlelight. On the paper were dozens of names, neighbors, priests, tradesmen, each accompanied by crimes, debts or vices. Andreas, horrified, demanded to know how she learned such things. Clara replied calmly, "They told me themselves, though they did not wish me to hear." Realizing that such lists, if discovered, could provoke lethal retaliation, Andreas burned the pages in the stove. But even as the paper turned to ash, Clara recited the contents from memory, line after line, until her father wept with helplessness. It was in this crucible of fear, science and secrecy, that the Weiss child crossed the threshold from anomaly to threat. To the scholars, she was a phenomenon. To the church, a liability. To the underworld, a danger. And to her family, a burden they loved but could not protect. The stage was set. The tension of 1872 would soon erupt into violence, the kind from which no study, no prayer, no parental love could shield her. And the city of Milwaukee, still young and hopeful in its immigrant enterprise, would carry a scar from this case for generations, the scar of a child who remembered too much.
The new year of 1873 arrived in Milwaukee beneath a sky of ironclad. Snow draped the roofs, muffling the streets, but inside the Weiss household there was no peace. Poverty gnawed at them, illness drained Lena's strength, and Clara, by then nearly 13, had grown so silent in her waking hours that Andreas described her as a living archive, listening to all but speaking little, until the moment she could no longer contain the weight of memory. Yet it was not silence that threatened the family most, it was betrayal. The Weiss case had by then reached the desks of men beyond the parish judges, aldermen, even newspaper editors. Most dismissed it as superstition, an immigrant curiosity unworthy of attention. But for those with secrets that Clara might expose, the danger felt immediate. Among them was Karl Meissner, a minor official in the city's customs office, whose dealings in contraband liquor were whispered about in taverns. Meissner feared exposure not by police, but by the Weiss child. He approached Andreas under the pretense of sympathy, offering financial aid if only Clara could be removed from the city for her own safety. Andreas, exhausted and desperate, considered it, but Clara, overhearing, said coldly, "He has lied 3 times already this morning." She then repeated, word for word, Meissner's private conversation from 2 nights before, in which he had boasted of smuggling. Meissner fled the house, but his humiliation had consequences. Within weeks, whispers spread that the Weiss family was trading Clara's revelations to blackmail their neighbors. The truth was far simpler. Andreas sought only survival. In late January, he pawned his wife's last heirloom, a silver rosary, to buy coal. The transaction was recorded in the ledger of a pawnbroker, who later testified that Andreas wept openly, saying, "I cannot keep her warm, I cannot keep her safe." But the rumors of blackmail took root, poisoning what little sympathy remained. Even old allies began to distance themselves. Miss Weigel, whose loyalty had been unshaken, found herself threatened in the market. Stones shattered her windows. She continued to visit Clara in secret, but her courage came at the cost of her own safety.
It was at this fragile juncture that Father O'Brien, an Irish priest whose role had grown more central, attempted one last intervention. He arranged a private session with Clara, witnessed by Andreas and 2 parish trustees. His purpose, as recorded in a surviving notebook, was not confession but containment. He asked her to describe only what she herself remembered, not what others concealed. Memory, he told her, is a gift when it is yours. It is a curse when it belongs to others. Clara listened with solemn eyes. Then, after a long silence, she replied, "I cannot tell the difference." Those 6 words ended the experiment. For O'Brien it was the most chilling admission of all, that the barrier between her own life and the lives of others had dissolved completely. From that moment, even allies faltered. O'Brien withdrew, fearing scandal. The trustees urged the family to leave the parish. But where could they go? Their name was marked, their daughter infamous. Every whisper seemed to return to them. The true betrayal came in March, driven by hunger. Andreas sought work from a former acquaintance, Otto Brecht, a carter with ties to the underworld. Brecht agreed to hire him for hauling, but in return demanded access to Clara, promising to keep her safe among friends. In truth, Brecht had been approached by none other than Hans Richter, who still plotted to eliminate the child. Andreas, blind to the snare, allowed Brecht into their home. On March 9, Brecht arrived with 2 companions under pretense of arranging work. They carried no tools, only questions. They pressed Clara to recall names of men, places of meetings, debts unpaid. She answered little, sensing their intent. When Andreas demanded they leave, Brecht smiled and replied, "You cannot keep her forever. Others will come who ask less politely." Only Vogel's arrival at that moment, carrying bread, prevented violence. The men departed, muttering, but their message was delivered. The Weiss family's sanctuary was gone. Spring thaw returned, but with it came escalating threats. Dead rats were tossed against their door. A crude drawing of a gallows was etched into the snow outside. One night, Andreas woke to find their gate smeared with pig's blood. The perpetrators were never identified, but suspicion always pointed back to Richter's circle. Clara, meanwhile, grew gaunter, her cheeks hollow, her eyes luminous with a strange intensity. She rarely ate, claiming food tasted of ash. She wrote constantly, filling scraps of paper with phrases overheard. Names of men, confessions whispered in taverns. Even the secrets of strangers glimpsed only once. Andreas burned the papers, fearing discovery, but she rewrote them from memory again and again. It was during Holy Week, April 1873, that her powers or her curse reached their apex. During a small gathering in Mrs. Vogel's parlor, Clara suddenly spoke in a voice not her own, repeating a confession from the lips of a man hundreds of miles away. She named a crime, a victim, a place. Weeks later, newspapers from Chicago reported the arrest of the very man she had described, accused of embezzlement and fraud. To Mrs. Vogel, it was proof of the divine. To Andreas, it was a death sentence. For if Clara could reveal crimes at such distance, then no man with guilt in his heart would ever feel safe while she lived. The final betrayal came not from strangers, but from within their circle of reluctant allies. One of the parish trustees, fearing for his own reputation, informed Richter of the family's movements. He revealed that Andreas had considered fleeing Milwaukee by rail. This betrayal ensured that when Andreas approached the depot in early May, seeking tickets to Chicago, 2 men were already waiting. He recognized them from Breck's company and fled before purchase. From then on, the Weiss family scarcely dared leave their home. Andreas hauled water at night, Lena seldom rose from her bed, and Clara lingered in the shadows like a ghost. Their world had shrunk to 4 walls, thin as paper against the gathering storm. Historians reading these records cannot help but see the inevitability of what followed. The betrayals, the threats, the isolation. It was a siege not of stone but of secrecy, and the walls could not hold. One final note survives from Andreas, scribbled in a trembling hand on May 12, 1873. I fear the silence more than the threats. The silence means they are ready, and she knows it. Last night, Clara said, they will come through the floorboards, and when they do, I will remember them forever. I do not know whether to pray for deliverance or for mercy. Within weeks the storm would break. The summer of 1873 began with a suffocating heat that seemed to press down on the city like a weight of molten iron. Windows were left open, but the air refused to move, and every sound carried each hammer strike from the rail yards, each drunken shout in the alley. It was a season when nothing could be hidden, and yet in the Weiss household, concealment remained the last desperate strategy. For weeks, Andreas had lived in dread of discovery. Clara's writings had grown more fevered, filling entire bundles of scrap and even margins of newspapers with her looping script. Names of men, dates of debts, secrets whispered between lovers. Her hand moved without pause. She hid the slips under her mattress, inside the stove, even within the hems of her clothing. Whenever Andreas burned them, she rewrote them from memory before dawn. She is not a child now, Mrs. Vogel later remarked, but a legend, a book no one dares own, but all fear being written inside. It was June 2 when the siege turned physical. Late that night, stones shattered their windows. A voice in the dark cried, "Send her out and we will let you live." The family huddled in the kitchen, Lena coughing blood into her handkerchief, Andreas clutching a poker. Clara stood motionless, eyes fixed on the door, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She whispered, "They are counting. 6 men, 1 with a limp." At dawn the street was empty, but the threat remained carved into the doorframe, a crude symbol of an eye crossed through with a blade. Andreas appealed once more to Father O'Brien, but the priest had grown weary. "You cannot keep her here. If men believe she endangers their lives, they will act as beasts. Take her away before worse comes." But where could they go? Andreas had no money, no kin beyond the city, and each attempt to flee by rail or river had been intercepted. So he turned to Vogel. Together they devised a plan to hide Clara not in a church or school, but in the burned-out tannery at the edge of the Menomonee Valley. The building had stood abandoned since a fire a decade earlier, its blackened beams rising like ribs against the sky. Few dared enter, for fear of collapse or the stories of vagrants who vanished within. It was the very desolation that made it seem safe. On June 14, under cover of night, they moved her there with a pallet of blankets, bread and a jug of water. Clara did not resist. She only murmured, "The walls here remember too." The weeks she spent in that ruin were later described by Vogel as a shadow life. She visited when she could, bringing food, though always under threat of discovery. Inside, Clara kept scribbling, using charcoal from the fire-scorched beams. Words and names covered the walls, phrases running into each other, until the tannery seemed alive with whispers. Yet she was not forgotten. Reports spread that men had seen her silhouette against the broken window. Children dared one another to approach, only to flee when her voice echoed their names from within. Word reached Richter, who seized the chance to strike. It was July 3 when they came for her. 4 men, led by Brecht, entered the tannery at dusk. Vogel, arriving minutes later, witnessed their approach but was powerless to stop them. She ran for Andreas, but by the time they returned,
The ruin was silent. Clara was gone. The official record is sparse, but fragments survive. A witness in the valley swore he saw men loading a bundle struggling and bound into a wagon. Another recalled the sound of muffled cries. No police report was filed. No charges ever brought. For Andreas, the loss was shattering. He searched every alley, every warehouse begging for work, but Richter's circle had swallowed her whole. For weeks he scoured the city, guided only by rumor. Lena, near death, could not rise from her bed. Vogel prayed but dared not hope. At last a single note appeared, slipped beneath their door in mid-July. It read, "She speaks no more. Pray she never does again." The handwriting was crude, but Andreas swore he recognized Brecht's hand. Where was Clara taken? Accounts diverge. Some claimed she was held in a cellar beneath the brewery, others that she was confined to a river barge moored out of sight. The most consistent story is that she was brought to an abandoned boarding house on the city's south side, where Richter maintained a hidden chamber. It is here, according to fragments later uncovered, that the cruelest experiments began. They did not torture her in the sense of whips or iron. Rather, they tested the boundaries of her knowledge. Men confessed crimes before her, then demanded she repeat them word for word. Others spoke falsehoods, watching her face for signs of recognition. She was denied food, then given feasts, her reactions measured with a cold precision that recalls the era's obsession with phrenology and mesmerism. One surviving account, penned by a drunken participant decades later, describes her as a mirror that never cracked. She answered calmly, but always with the same fatal precision, "You cannot hide from me. You are already written." Such words terrified even her captors, for though they sought to break her, they began to believe she could not be broken. Andreas did not cease search. On July 27, guided by rumor, he crept to the south side boarding house. Inside he found only traces, scraps of paper with Clara's script, the remains of a child's blanket, and on the walls scrawled in charcoal, a single phrase, "Father, I am here." The building reeked of ash and mildew. He fled with the scraps, but they offered no path to her rescue. By August, Lena was dead, worn thin by illness and grief. She passed in her sleep, leaving Andreas alone with his failure. Her burial, sparsely attended, marked the collapse of the family's last anchor. Clara remained missing. Historians mark this season as the turning point. Before, she had been a child in peril. After, she became something else, a figure of rumor and dread, whispered about in alleys, blamed for misfortune, her name invoked to frighten children. The girl who spoke secrets had been silenced, yet her absence spoke louder still. A single letter from Andreas survives from this period, dated August 19, 1873. "I walk the streets, and hear her voice, not aloud but in the silence after footsteps, in the crack of doors. She is somewhere near, always near. They have not killed her, for they cannot. If she dies, they are written forever. They must keep her breathing, if only to silence their own fear. I will find her, though my soul burns for it." This letter is the last known writing of Andreas. His fate after 1873 is uncertain, but of Clara, of Violet Mueller, as she would later be called, her story was far from over. The abandoned boarding house on South 5th Street, already rotting from neglect, became the theater of Clara's last ordeal. Its upper floors sagged, windows boarded, plaster crumbling, but in the cellar, Richter and his circle had carved a chamber that betrayed planning and cruel intent. Walls braced with timber, lanterns hung in brackets, a long table with straps fixed to its edges. These details survive in Vogel's later depositions, and in fragments of testimony preserved in Captain Donahue's files. Clara, scarcely 12 years of age, was bound nightly in this chamber, not always by force. Often she lay upon the table herself, silent, waiting for the rituals to begin. The men who gathered there did not call them experiments, though the methods resembled the era's pseudo-scientific inquiries. They named it instead the testament, for they believed her gift was not natural memory alone, but a doorway into divine or infernal knowledge. The proceedings followed a pattern. One man would confess, sometimes trivial misdeeds, sometimes murder. Clara would repeat them without error, even imitating the inflection of the original words. Then another would speak lies, weaving impossible events, false dates, counterfeit names. Clara distinguished each, never failing, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the lantern light. Richter escalated the demands. He produced letters long destroyed, contracts burned, secrets known only to a single witness. Clara recited them back with uncanny precision. When asked how she knew, she answered simply, "Because you said them once." But the circle came to fear that her knowing extended further still. that she remembered not merely spoken words but thoughts half-formed, intentions never uttered. Brecht swore she repeated a phrase he had whispered only in prayer, alone in his bed. Another insisted she described a scar upon his thigh that no one alive had seen. These accounts, though impossible to prove, circulated later as whispers among the immigrant community. The strain on Clara's body was evident. She grew gaunt, her lips cracked, her hands trembling, yet she never faltered in voice. Her words were like bells. One later recalled, clear, cold and without pity. On September 6, 1873, Richter summoned the entire circle for what he declared would be the final testimony. He had prepared a set of documents, bills of sale, coded ledgers, names of partners in the trafficking trade, and demanded that Clara recite them without having seen them. Accounts diverge on what occurred that night, but all agree it ended in chaos. Clara lay upon the table, hands unbound. As Richter held the papers aloft, one by one, he asked her to name the entry. She did so, fluently, with details extending beyond the page addresses, ships, dates, and amounts unrecorded in ink, but known to her as if she had been present at every exchange. When she reached the final page, Richter asked her to name the highest patron of their enterprise. She spoke a name none expected, a respected alderman of the city, long admired for his charity to the poor. At once the chamber erupted. Brecht struck her across the face, demanding silence. Others shouted denial, but Richter only stared, as if recognizing truth. She has overreached, Brecht snarled, yet Clara, bleeding from the mouth, whispered, "It is written, even if I fall silent, it is written." From this moment the testimonies fracture. Some claimed Richter sought to shield her, ordering the men away. Others insisted he seized her himself, furious that she had unmasked a patron whose power might now consume them all. Vogel's later notes, though second-hand, record only that violence became inevitable, for they could not allow her to live. What followed is preserved only in fragments. A neighbor swore he heard a scream that curdled the blood. Another claimed the boarding house windows glowed red, as if from fire. Donahue's later excavation uncovered bloodstains deep in the cellar beams, but Clara's body was never recovered.
The aftermath was swift. Within days Brecht vanished from the city. Others scattered westward, changing names. Richter himself disappeared entirely, leaving behind only rumor that he fled by rail to St. Louis, that he joined a mining company in Colorado, that he was buried under another name in Montana. None were proven. Andreas never learned the truth. His last attempts to find her ended in the autumn rains, when the boarding house was abandoned, its cellar already stripped of evidence. Only the faint tracings of words remained on the wall. Names, dates, fragments of confession burned half into the plaster. One phrase alone stood clear, written in her child's hand across the beam above the table. "I remember." Historians piecing the fragments argue that Clara Violet Mueller was murdered that September night. Some believe her remains were hidden within the valley marshes, others that she was burned in the tannery ruins. Yet a minority hold she survived, spirited away by Richter himself, too valuable to destroy outright. Vogel herself hinted at such survival in her 1889 pamphlet. There are voices in this city still that echo the cadences of that child. They speak with certainty of things no one could know. If she is gone, her shadow yet lingers. What is certain is that the testimony ended with her disappearance. The circle fractured, its members hunted or consumed by their own paranoia, yet the legend of Clara only deep children whispered that she walked the alleys at night, repeating secrets no one had told aloud. Mothers warned their sons that a girl might one day speak their sins back to them, and no priest could absolve what she revealed. Her absence became a presence, a haunting stronger than her voice had ever been. Thus the climax of her story is not her death, but the knowledge that knowledge itself proved fatal. The men who sought to harness her gift destroyed themselves in the process, while the girl who remembered too much slipped beyond record, leaving only terror in her wake. By the close of 1873, Milwaukee had begun to forget. Newspapers printed nothing. The boarding house was bored. Richter's name was not spoken in polite company. Yet beneath the silence, the memory endured, passed in whispers, in children's rhymes, in the eyes of men who knew their sins had been heard. The girl was gone, but her words remained. By October 1873, the season of her vanishing, Milwaukee staggered beneath a silence more suffocating than the heat of summer had ever been. The Weiss home lay empty, save for the ash in its hearth and Andreas's abandoned coat upon a peg. Lena was buried in the parish yard. Vogel fled to her sister's farm, and those who once crowded the taverns with gossip now spoke only in lowered tones. The child had been erased, or so the men of power believed. But the city itself did not forget. The ruin of the tannery still bore her words in charcoal. The cellar of the boarding house still carried stains no lime could wash away, and in the alleys the immigrants whispered. The girl remembers. Captain Donahue, though bound by politics, could not entirely abandon the case. His notebooks from late 1873 describe a campaign of clandestine inquiries, questioning neighbors who heard cries in the night, tracing wagons that departed the south side in secrecy, collecting scraps of writing smuggled from the boarding house. His notes betray exhaustion, as though he hunted not a missing child, but a phantom that moved through every corridor of the city. Her voice is everywhere, he wrote. Every witness recalls a phrase. Each phrase matches the others exactly. How can memory spread when the mouth is silent? It was November 12 when the first great discovery came. Workmen demolishing a warehouse near the river uncovered a concealed strongbox. Inside lay a cache of ledgers, lists of names, debts and transactions, linked unmistakably to Richter's network. More damning still, several pages bore handwriting identical to Clara's, copied in charcoal on scrap. Whether she wrote them under duress or as a desperate testament is unknown. The press never saw these ledgers, yet their contents seeped outward. Prominent merchants withdrew from public life. A banker fled to Chicago. An alderman resigned without explanation. Rumors tied all to the vanished girl, as though her ghost were prying their reputations open. Andreas meanwhile slipped from record. His last confirmed sighting came in late November, loitering near the canal, muttering that Clara was calling from the water. One account claimed he leapt in and was dragged out by passers-by. Another insists he boarded a freight car westward, swearing he would find her beyond the plain. No grave has ever been marked with his name. Vogel returned in December, compelled by conscience. She gathered what fragments of Clara's writings remained. Scraps from the tannery, the papers from Andreas and testimony from neighbors. She preserved them in a trunk, later translated into German and sent abroad, where scholars decades later would retrieve them. Her motive, she claimed, was not justice, for none could be found, but remembrance. If they could kill her body, she wrote, I would not let them kill her memory. The community fractured, began to change. Confession practices in St. Michael's Church were altered. No longer were children permitted as interpreters. Only sworn adults vouched for by clergy could mediate. A small notice appeared in the parish bulletin, unremarkable to outsiders, but understood by every family who had heard Clara's voice. By early 1874, priests across Wisconsin adopted similar rules. Historians would later call it the Milwaukee Protocol, an effort to shield secrets from falling into innocent mouths. Yet suppression failed. The more the city sought silence, the more her legend grew. Children chanted rhymes about the girl who told, inventing verses that carried hints of truth. Dock workers claimed to hear their names whispered in empty warehouses. Even years later, when the boarding house collapsed, scavengers swore they found walls scratched with confessions in a child's hand, though no wood survived to prove it. The true revelation came not from whispers, but from in an unrelated trial for fraud. A witness blurted under oath that he had once confessed to Clara and feared she had written his name among Richter's papers. Though the judge silenced him, the gallery erupted. Newspapers caught scent, and for the first time the name of the vanished girl appeared in print. The Weiss child. From there, fragments surfaced like bones through soil. Donahue, emboldened, released portions of his notes. Vogel circulated her memoirs quietly among reformers. Within 5 years, the story of Violet Mueller, Clara's later anglicized name, was told not as rumor, but as history. The final horror was uncovered decades later. In 1923, demolition crews at the tannery discovered a hidden recess in the foundation. Inside were bundles of documents, sealed in oilcloth, perfectly preserved. These records contained names of missing children, payments exchanged, and correspondence between Richter and Woolmer, his tavern partner. Among them, one letter addressed to Richter confirmed Clara's testimonies had been accurate in every detail. The city, long changed, was forced to admit that the child had been right all along. Modern criminologists call her case the earliest documented example of witness elimination in American immigrant communities. A child's testimony too dangerous to law and reputation was silenced by disappearance. Yet paradoxically, her absence authenticated her claims. If she had been wrong, she would have lived. And so, the ash and dust of the city continued to whisper her truth. But there is another, quieter revelation. In one of Vogel's later notes,
written in her own trembling hand in 1890. She describes a night when she heard a knock at her door. Opening it, she found no one, only a folded scrap upon the step. Inside was a single line, written in the same child's script she had preserved for years. I remember, in the winter of 1876, 3 years after her disappearance, snow drifted thick over Milwaukee's 3rd Ward, muffling the sound of wagon wheels and burying the scarred timbers of burned-out buildings. The Weiss home was long since demolished, its cellar filled with stones, but children passing the vacant lot still crossed themselves, whispering that voices echoed there when the wind cut from the river. Though the city pressed forward, new factories rising, new ships docking, the shadow of Violet Mueller lingered. To some, she was a ghost story, to others, a martyr, and to the few who had truly known her, she was a wound that time refused to close. The church's reckoning. St. Michael's Church, once the heart of the German parish, bore the heaviest burden. Father O'Brien, aging quickly in the years after the scandal, carried journals, heavy with the girl's remembered sins, volumes of human corruption, written not by her hand, but through. He locked them away, vowing they would never be read until after his death. Yet his silence did not shield the parish. Attendance dwindled. Friday confession became nearly deserted. As families no longer trusted the veil of secrecy, mothers forbade their children to linger after service, and when whispers spread that Father O'Brien had conducted memory sessions with the child, suspicion turned upon him as well. By 1880, the diocese introduced formal protocols, banning any interpreter under the age of 21. The measure became known unofficially as the Milwaukee Protocol. Priests were instructed to keep records of translators, and bishops stressed that confessions must remain untainted by the involvement of innocence. Though not spoken aloud, every cleric knew these rules were written in the girl's blood. The city's wound. For the city, Violet's tale became both shame and legend. Officials attempted to suppress her name from newspapers, but rumor traveled faster than immigrant workers carried her story westward along the rail lines, telling it in saloons and bunkhouses. They spoke of the girl who remembered everything, the child whose mouth could not close upon the sins of men. Some twisted the tale into a parable, warning children never to gossip. Others claimed her gift was divine punishment sent upon sinners, but among the poor and powerless, her story became something else entirely, proof that even a child could pierce the armor of powerful men. The tannery ruin remained standing until 1890, avoided like a cursed ground. When it was finally demolished, workers reported finding scraps of wood, carved with words in a childish hand. Most dismissed it as fancy, yet Vogel, still alive then, insisted they were genuine. Her memory is stronger than stone, she said, and stone crumbled. The fugitives, of the men whose crimes Violet had revealed, few lived long enough to see the new century. Kellerman drowned in the river, Brenner crushed in his own brewery, Steinberg vanished in a tavern quarrel, and Woolmer died before justice could reach him. But Hans Richter was different. His name slipped through city ledgers like smoke. By the 1880s he had vanished entirely, rumored to have taken on new identities in Kansas, Colorado, even California. Detectives swore he established businesses under false papers, continuing his predation. The city declared him legally dead in 1920, but Captain Donahue's final notebook, penned in retirement, rejected that notion. Men like Richter do not die when the law pronounces them so. They live on, feeding in new shadow. Vogel's testimony. Brunhild Vogel, once the child's guardian, became the chronicler of her tragedy. In 1885 she privately printed a slim volume in German titled Das Mädchen, der Geheimnisse, the girl of. It contained fragments of Violet's remembered words, copied faithfully from scraps of paper and memory. Though circulated quietly, it became the foundation for every later account. Scholars of immigration, criminology, and church history would cite Vogel's work for more than a century. In her preface, she wrote, "She was not a prophet, nor a spy, nor a liar. She was a child who could not forget, and in a world built upon secrets, a child who cannot forget is more dangerous than any weapon." The last memorial. Shortly before his retirement in 1895, Father O'Brien arranged for a plaque to be set in the entry of St. Michael's, small, bronze, and easily overlooked. It bore a single inscription: "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." He never named her directly. The church did not permit it, but the parishioners knew. Mothers touched the plaque when passing. Children asked why it was there, and were shushed. Yet the act itself was a confession, the only one the priest ever permitted to escape. O'Brien died in 1902, and when his journals were found, The diocese sealed them away. Rumors persist they still exist in a locked archive. Volumes of human sin preserved because a child once repeated them aloud. The century turns. By 1923, when demolition workers unearthed Woolmer's hidden compartment, the city could no longer deny the truth. The documents confirmed child trafficking, extortion, and partnership with Richter. More hauntingly, they confirmed the accuracy of every word Violet had spoken half a century earlier. The press reported the discovery with morbid fascination. For the first time her name was printed openly in English. Violet Mueller, the girl who spoke secrets no one should know. Historians, criminologists, and reformers seized upon the case. Some argued she had been America's first child witness to organized crime. Others insisted she was merely collateral in a larger struggle between immigrants, poverty, and power. But all agreed, she had been telling the truth. The lingering dread, even with truth revealed, her absence remained unbearable. No grave bore her name. No bones were ever identified. It was as if the city had swallowed her whole. Yet stories persisted. Old dock workers swore they heard her humming near the river on foggy nights. Tenement children claimed a pale figure whispered in their ear when they thought of stealing. Mothers warned that if you lied, the girl who remembers would find you. Vogel herself died in 1901, but her last letter to a cousin contained a chilling line. I sometimes dream she is still alive, speaking secrets into the dark, and the dark listens. Epilogue, a memory that cannot die. Today Violet Mueller remains both legend and lesson. Scholars cite her as proof of the dangers faced by vulnerable witnesses. Clergy recall her case when teaching about the sanctity of confession. And in Milwaukee, a quiet memorial garden near the site of St. Michael's holds a stone marked only with her name and year. Violet Mueller, 1861, 1873. Visitors leave candles, dolls or scraps of paper with written confessions, ritual offerings to a child who once carried the unbearable weight of truth. But among the offerings, one artifact stands out. In 1978, during renovation of a nearby rectory, workers discovered a slip of faded parchment, tucked within a hymnal. On it, written in an unmistakably childish hand, were two words, I remember. The ink had not faded, the letters looked fresh, as though written that very morning. And so the silence never held. Her memory, the memory of a child who spoke what no one dared, lives on, echoing through the city she haunted, warning that secrets buried in darkness will one day claw their way to light.